Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today, we pay tribute to the late Gerald Locklin, a wonderful poet and beloved teacher. In 1974, I went to the Norton Simon Museum with Michael C. Ford and Alexandra Garrett to see a poetry event in the theater. Michael said, "Look behind us to the right. Gerald Locklin, Ron Koertge, and Charles Stettler, all poets." That was my first sighting of Locklin and Koertge. Over the years, I would talk with Locklin about sports and poetry, usually at poetry readings. Joyful, loving, sagacious are the words I use to describe Locklin's poetry. He was born in 1941 in Rochester, New York. Gerald received his PhD from Arizona University in 1964. He taught at Cal State University, LA in 1964 to 1965, where my late wife, Holly Prado, studied with him. Locklin taught at Long Beach State from 65 to 2007. Maybe that's the same thing as Cal State University, Long Beach. He died of COVID-19 in early 2021. Gerald was a masterful and prolific poet whom I deeply admired. Ron Koertge, Ray Zepeda, and Bill Mohr will read Locklin's poetry and talk about the poetry and the poet. Ron Koertge, a fixture in the LA poetry scene for decades, is the author of a dozen books of poetry. The latest are Yellow Moving Van, University of Pittsburgh Press, and Olympusville, Red Hen Press. He has grants from the NEA and the California Arts Council, poems in Best American Poetry, and is a recipient of a Pushcart Prize. He is also the author of Negative Space, shortlisted for an Oscar in animated short films in 2018. Billy Collins, two-time Poet Laureate of the US, calls Ron's work, quote, sly, inventive, and deeply good-hearted. Here's Ron Koertge.
Hello, everybody. But that's a nice list that Harry just read off of the names of my books and nice things that have happened to me. And I don't think that any of those would have been possible or would be possible without my friendship with Jerry. So I want to go back to 1962. I may chat a little more about Jerry than Bill or Ray. I mean, they knew him, of course, but Jerry and I spent a lot of time together. In 1962, I went to the University of Arizona in Tucson to be a graduate student. I graduated from the U of I maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 months before. I had applied because if I stayed in my hometown, I was going to be an alcoholic. I was just drinking too much, running around, behaving badly, and I wanted to get away. So I went to the University of Arizona. That offered me a teaching assistantship, which was something like $1,500 a semester. I guess that was big money in those days. But it's where I met Jerry. And we were there, and he began to show me what he called little magazines. And I went to my files, I refer to those casually. These are the names of magazines that, if not while we were at the U of A, then while Jerry and I were in Southern California. These are magazines that we published in, and I wouldn't have been publishing in them without Jerry's enthusiasm and guidance. So the Wormwood Review, Little Caesar, Poetry Now, Occident, Sunset Palms Hotel, Vagabond, Purr, California Quarterly, Mid-Atlantic Review, Roadhouse, Momentum, Big Boulevard. The list really goes on and on. These magazines in those days often lasted 2 or 3 issues worth. They had the lifespan of fruit flies. They would come out, they would publish a bunch of marginal and outre poets like us, and then the magazine would die and we would all move on. I'm going to read a poem by Jerry to begin my little my part of this program, and I'll read a longer one at the end. This poem is called Timing is Everything. Timing is everything. And the horoscope this morning really put me on my guard, sent the adrenaline coursing through my veins as it predicted a crucial confrontation that would require all the will and ingenuity that I could muster until I remembered I was looking at a week-old student newspaper. When I saw those kind of poems, either from Jerry or in one of the reviews, that the names of which I just read, I remember telling Jerry in 1965 or 6, God, I could write stuff like that. And he said, sure. He said, you're a clever guy. Why don't you try? That why don't you try launched an entire career. Let me just tell you briefly the milestones in my life that have Jerry's name on them. So Jerry taught at Cal State Los Angeles, just a few miles from where I live in Southern California, for 1 year. And he moved to Cal State Long Beach. But while he was at Cal State LA, his office mate there, a woman, her husband was the head of the department at PCC, the City College in Pasadena. She mentioned to Jerry her husband was looking for a teacher at the community college. Jerry called me immediately. I called the guy at PCC. I went, I had an interview. He gave me the job. I was 25 years old. I was the youngest member of the department. The next youngest member was 44. I started there in 65 and I didn't leave for 37 years. One more milestone. Jerry and Mary Alice, his then wife, lived in a duplex in Alhambra, about 6 miles from here. Upstairs were friends of his in the duplex, Bill Vasconcelos and his wife. Bill's sister, Sherry Jean Vasconcelos, was introduced to me when I was over visiting Jerry one time. She and I started to date. Eventually, we got married. So I have a job, thanks to Jerry. I have a career, thanks to Jerry. And I had a wife for 10 years, thanks to Jerry. The divorce was not Jerry's fault. It was entirely mine. I was looking, when I was looking for Jerry's poems, I was looking for some details about him that maybe Bill or Ray will talk about also. We're talking about somebody who in his lifetime wrote 155 books and chapbooks and more than 3,000 poems, stories, interviews, and articles. I mean, I've published a lot, but that's nothing compared to what Jerry did. When Jerry and I, we did some workshops together in addition to dozens of poetry readings. But besides teaching me how to submit to magazines, how to enclose a self-addressed stamped envelope, who to talk to, besides all of that, when we would do a workshop, he was so much more patient than I. I just wanted to move the students along and, make the poem better as soon as I could. And Jerry, just like he was patient with me, had this attitude of, well, let's call the student Bob. This is pretty good. And right here in the middle is where you ought to think. This is the hot spot. So besides everything else, Jerry taught me patience. I don't know how many poems that I would not have written without Jerry's tutelage. I have a poem called Moving Day that's completely autobiographical. When I was a grad student and when Jerry was still in Tucson, he and I hung out a lot. He was married, I wasn't married, but Jerry wasn't one to be tied down by, bourgeois Lilliputians. He did what he wanted, and he did when he wanted. So we ran around together like we were both single, even though I was the only one. One of the things he did was help me move house. I would move from apartment to apartment to save $20, or because my girlfriend was mad at me, or I moved 10 times in 2 years. And he said to me once, he said, Ronnie, there's got to be a better way. And I remember at that moment thinking, oh, gee, there's a poem in here somewhere. And sure enough, I wrote a poem called Moving Day. Two guys are moving. One of them says, there's got to be a better way. And the main character thinks of a better way. He thinks that what he should do is keep his lights on all night and keep everything valuable out in his room so that when the thieves come, they will carry out all of his good things out and put them in their moving van or their truck. And then he can shoot them both, get in their van, and drive himself to his new apartment. That kind of goofiness I got from reading the little magazines and from hanging around with Jerry. He had no holds barred. The little poem that I read before, Timing is Everything, about reading the student newspaper, that's one end of the continuum where he could write. The other end was writing for Mercer magazines. He was publishing in magazines that I thought were stuffy, but his poems were never that way. They were smart, they were erudite, but they were never stuffy or foolish in that full-blown way where you want to hate the poet. When Jerry and I had workshops together, or we would have readings, he was always the generous one. He was the one who would talk to the younger poets when we were through. He was the one who would talk to Bukowski and keep him from insulting our wives. He was such a prime mover in my life and in many people's lives. So let me read you a longer poem by Jerry. And maybe Harry has a question for me. This is a good example of such a touching poem. The little poem about that I keep talking about now, where he's reading the student newspaper, is one at the end of a continuum. And a poem like this is the other in its frank open-heartedness. This poem is called No Longer a Teenager. And one of the other things Jerry taught me and hundreds of his students, if you don't have a title, just pull the first line up and make the first line the title, and which is what he did in this poem. No longer a teenager, my daughter has become truly independent. She doesn't need her father to help her deal with bureaucracies of schools, HMOs, insurance, or the DMV. She's quite capable of handling landlords, bosses, and auto repair shops, not to mention boyfriends and roommates and her mother. Frankly, it's been a big relief. The teenage years were often stressful, and sometimes, though, now I feel a little useless. But when my daughter drove down from Northern California to visit us for a couple of days, she came through the door with the biggest, warmest hug in the world for me. And when we all went out for lunch later, she said, affecting a little girl's voice, I'm going to sit next to my daddy. And she did, and slid over close to me so I could put my arm around her shoulder until the food arrived. I've been keeping busy since she's gone, mainly with teaching and writing, a little travel connected with both. But I realize now how long it had been since I felt deep emotion. And when she left, I said simply, I love you. And she replied quietly, I love you too. And you know, it isn't always easy for a 20-year-old to say that. And it isn't always easy for a father. Literature and opera are full of characters who die for love. I stay alive for her.
Could you explain to me, Ron, how you would define Locklin's style? I mean, there's a spareness to it. At times I've seen him, bring forth a vaudevillian aspect in his poetry. How, people always bring up Bukowski, but I think he's a little bit different than Bukowski. There's how would you explain his style as a poet?
I think the best label for that, Harry, would come from a book that Charles Webb and Suzanne Lummis put out maybe 20 or 30 years ago, a book called Stand Up Poetry. Jerry, I mean, he would do just what you said. He was a vaudevillian. He would click up his heels he would talk about being a tap dancer when he was in grade school and high school. And the definition of stand-up poetry by Charles and Suzanne was simply like the phrase stand-up guy, like the gangster's phrase. And you can trust him, he's a stand-up guy. So in stand-up poetry, those of us who were in the magazine or in the book, probably Bill and probably Ray, were trustworthy. We weren't going to be fatuous. We weren't going to be full of hot air. We were going to write as well as we could. And we were going to have a good time doing it.
I like that. Okay, Ron, let's hear another poem or a few more stories. We got some more time for you.
I'll read you one of his Edward Hopper poems. Jerry was the smartest person I know, and the smartest person maybe I knew. He's modest about it, but he had an encyclopedic memory. I'll tell you this story before I'll read you the poem. When he and I would go out there's a bar in Tucson called the Green Dolphin. We like to go there and shoot pool and drink beer with the other grad students and, have a good time. And while we were there at the pool table or in the booze, he would say to me, "Oh, Ron, the next test by Professor X is probably going to be on the fin de siècle artist. And if that is the text, here are the questions he's going to ask." So Jerry would take this test a year or two before and remember every question on the test. So I would write the questions on the back of the bar napkins. I would take the bar napkins home and look up the answers so that I was prepared. So when I got to the test, I looked pretty smart, but the smart person was Jerry. I was simply smart enough, to listen to it. I remember when I had trouble in graduate school, and I knew that I was not PhD material. I'm not bright in that way. So I elected to go for a master's degree and with my fingers crossed, hope that I got, that far. I had trouble in the master's orals. And I, at one point thought, oh, I'm screwed. This isn't going to happen. I'm going to have to stay here. And I had a job lined up, but I did pass. I wrote a very funny poem called Why I Believe in God, which is about that particular incident. But the point is, I met Jerry afterwards at the Panda Bar. We were going to celebrate, and I came in, and I'd been crying because I was so embarrassed by my performance in my orals and so relieved that I passed. I had my suit on, and I came in, and I was just a mess. And he said, "You okay?" And I said, "Well, I almost failed my orals. I mean, I almost lost the job that I already, had." And he said, "But you passed." And I said, "Well, yeah, I passed." And he said, "Forget it. That's the important thing." And then we had some drinks and we had a good time. So here's a poem. I mean, the point of that was he was such a realist. He was romantic in many ways, but he was a realist about business. And we were in the master's degree business. This is an Edward Hopper poem about Edward Hopper, one of his paintings called Sailing Boat. It's just such a good example of Jerry's vast interest in almost everything. Here's the poem. Birds of every feather oblige our sense of order with the ways in which they stick together, the formations that they fly in, the hierarchies of their afternoon prayer meetings, their worship of the sun, the wind, their internalized clocks, their calendars, their almanacs and regimental flocks. We salute them in our sailing boats and religious ceremonies. Our billowing sails, our masteries of flotation, there's absolutely nothing they can learn from us. Take, for instance, Frank Gehry's designs for the Disney Concert Hall. and every other structure he's designed since Bilbao. When those birds fly past these, they yawn in unison. It's Jerry's ways of getting in a few licks about how much he disliked Disney Concert Hall, which he thought was a monstrosity.
Well, that looks to me like a nice place to stop. It really shows me the true friendship you had and how tuned in you both were. And I appreciate the relaxation and the love that you show, and the freedom that both you and Gerald have in your poetry, and also the love for your students and poetry in general. So thank you very much, Ron. And our next poet, next reader is Ray Zepeda, is a professor of English at CSU Long Beach. His books include the novel Desperados, Can This Wolf Survive?, House Medicine, and Other Stories, and Dow Driver and Selected Poems. He has received an NEA Creative Writing Fellowship in Fiction, a California Arts Fellowship in Fiction, and a PEN Syndicated Fiction Award. Here's Ray Zepeda.
Hello. I have a bunch of poems here that I can read, but first I'm going to start out with when I met Jerry. This was I'd been away. It was during the '60s, and so I'd been away for 5 or 6 years, on ships and here and there and everywhere. And I came back from being away, and I thought it was a good idea to go to college. It's like I was 25 or 26. I said, I better do something here. Something's, I didn't like being on ships. It was terrible. And so I thought it was romantic in the first place, but it's not romantic. It's hell on the water. It's a terrible place. But anyway, my brother, he's a artist, a lithographer. He teaches at Art Center. He's been teaching there for 30 odd years. But he needed to take a class from someone in literature because he needed it for his degree. And so he took a class from Jerry. When I got back, he said, I was going to state then, and he said, you got to take a class from this guy. This guy's a good guy. He gets up there and he talks about sports, and he reads some of his poems, and he's funny, and he's amiable, and he asks everybody to come out and have a beer with him. And so I said, well, that's a good idea. I'll take it up on that. I was trying to apply to be an art major at the time. And oddly enough, the major was closed. I couldn't be an art major. And so I thought, well, I like literature and writing a little bit, so maybe I'll try that, And so I took the class from Jerry, and Jerry was funny, and he was very receptive and friendly. And he said at the end of the class, why don't we go have a beer, everybody? I'm going to meet you at the 49er. This is a place, there were hardly any bars in Long Beach then that had students in them, but 49er was one of them. And, so we went to the 49er, and we ended up being in the 49er and various bars together for 30 years or so, right? And anyway, Jerry was writing these poems, and they were funny, and they were witty, and I didn't know. I was interested in fiction, to be honest. I was interested in fiction, and through him, I met Bukowski's work and Ron's work and Bill's work and Stetler's work and everybody, when I was there at Long Beach State getting a degree. And then I went in fiction. I went to Oregon to get an MFA in fiction. And I was never writing poems. Even though I liked Jerry's poems and Bukowski's and Ron's and Charles's and everybody's, I was never writing poems. I was always writing short stories and a novel at the time. But I came back and I got a job at Long Beach State after I graduated. And Jerry was now my friend, and he helped me get that job. You know, I mean, and I ended up in that job for 45 years, right? Until then, I'm still teaching like one semester a year. But I was there, and the main reason I was there was because of three people: Jerry, a guy named John Herman, and another guy named Bill Jakewith. And I started taking these literature classes from them, and they said they were interested. I thought there was this big magic thing about literature, you know, that it had to be, I mean, there was some magic key that you had, and the professors had that, and they were going to let me know what it was. But anyways, so, you know, I was 25, and I think this is the way most people are, especially about poems. They say, well, I can't, like a good friend of mine, Leo Hessel, who's a photographer and surfer. He says, I can't read poems. They're terrible, except I can read your poems. He says, because, you know, you're telling stories and they're conversational and you don't have all these metaphors out there. Anyway, so I got back and I wrote one poem, and it was about the Mexicans coming up from Mexico and tearing down the buildings and taking all of the stuff down to Mexico and back. Anyway, that was the first poem that I really wrote seriously, and the first poem that I published. And I published it in I think Wormwood. Right. And that's where I heard about Wormwood from Jerry. And you know, it's just very humble magazine. Bill held one up a minute ago, but this is another one. This is a special edition of Jerry's stuff. It's just Jerry stuff, nobody else's. And they had Bukowski do that, and they had center sections of people, you know. And Jerry had a ton of center sections. I had one. He had a few of these books, these special books. Anyways, I started writing the poems, and you know, it was fun. I was having fun, and Jerry's always said, hey, you know, if you're having fun, then it's okay, because that's going to be pretty good. You know, at least you're having fun. So I ended up becoming a writer only because of Jerry and these other two friends. If it wasn't for them, I would have been an art major. I mean, I was going to take a few classes and then be a painting major. You know, I like painting, but I was leaning toward the conceptual. And this is another thing Jerry is, it's interesting about Jerry. I was leaning toward the conceptual. So the conceptual, I don't know if you know about conceptual art, but it's kind of all in your head stuff, you know. I mean, stuff that you can't sell mostly. Like one friend of mine was a guy, Barry LeVay, and he would run back. He ran back and forth in this gallery and ran into the wall and taped it. And he ended up being famous, Barry LeVay, right? He was a friend of mine. And one time, you know, I saw some of his work, and it was a bunch of felt on the ground. And I said, what in the hell is that, Barry? He says, well, that's my art, right? But Jerry, in his own way, was a conceptual artist too. You know, his ideas were not in the traditional sense of the word poetry, you know, not poetic, so to speak. You know. One of his ideas, and I've heard from a guy who writes for the LA Times, that they didn't like, a lot of people didn't like this very much, but he wrote a poem and he sent it to the LA Times, and they put the poem in the LA Times. The poem was called Tribute to John Cage. And all it was I don't know if you know John Cage's music or not, but John Cage did this one poem that he walked out on the stage and he said, he names his poem 4 minutes and 47 seconds. And he stood there for 4 minutes and 47 seconds and said nothing, right? In the meantime, taping all of the people in the auditorium. And so when he was done with that, he taped it back. He played it back to him, and that was the music, right? The sound of the audience. Anyway, Jerry did this poem, and all it was on the LA Times was a square with nothing in it, except for it's a tribute to John Cage, 4 minutes and 47 seconds. And that was Jerry's kind of leaning toward being a conceptual artist. And also his being, like Ron was saying, his doing tap dancing, doing the Cossack squat, doing all of these things. He did it over and over again. I must have seen him do the tap dancing thing and the bell step. I must have seen him do that 50 times.
Yeah.
At least. He kept doing it over and over. And he said he learned, he read many of the same poems over and over again at his readings because they went well, and he said he learned that from Johnny Carson. If you tell a good joke, you can always tell it later and it's still a good joke, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, Jerry and I ended up, we wrote 8 or 9 chapbooks together. And we wrote other things, like movie stuff. And everybody, wants to write a movie, and we were doing that. In the meantime, Jerry was writing. I have a book here. This is one of his early books. It's called Poop. And I'm going to read the poem, that poem Poop, in a minute here. It's really a very funny poem. But this, I noticed, was his 3rd book. And this was way back in the 70s. And he ended up writing, I think Ron said 150, something like that, 150 books, right? Yeah. I mean, it's unbelievable amount of stuff he had. A friend of his and mine went to his office after he'd passed away, and he pulled some of his stuff out, and he had manuscripts and all these reviews and all this stuff he had collected over the years. He cleaned out his office at the university, which they'd given him access to for the rest of his life, they said, which they changed their mind, but they said for the rest of his life. Yeah. But anyway, this guy, Todd, got 10 boxes about, 3 by 2, and he put all of his Jerry stuff in that, and he unloaded it, and he has those 10 boxes, and we're going to give them to somebody one of these days. But anyway, Jerry was probably one of the most generous people I ever met. Yeah. He would always help people if they needed to know some place to write a poem or wanted to hear his point of view about their work. He would read it and he would talk to them about it, and usually he would just encourage them to do it, And like Ron said, there were all these little magazines, and I never even heard about little magazines until I met Jerry. I didn't have any idea that those things were around. But Jerry, over the years, helped so many people that it was ridiculous. I met a guy who was a banker, a loan officer up in Central California. We were buying some property up there. And this guy ended up said, "Oh, you taught at Long Beach State." He said, "Do you know Gerry Locklin?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, Gerry Locklin helped me to graduate from college. I'd been away from college. I'd stopped college with one class to go, And I wanted to finish my degree. And so I went back and I asked Jerry Locklin if I could take a class with him, and he signed me up. And because of him, I graduated from college, So this guy up in Central California, and how many other people he influenced like that, just because of his kindness. But anyway, I'm going to read a few of his poems, and then you can ask me questions if you want. The Motive. This is a lot of his. He told me once that he had no visual imagination, which I don't think is true, but a lot of this, he doesn't have any much visual stuff in this, but he has great ideas. The Motive. As a writer, you get to seek popularity or immortality, riches or fame, rewards for your labor in this life or the next. It's highly unlikely you'll achieve both. The nature of originality tends to render the two mutually exclusive. Of course, the strongest odds are that you'll end up with neither. I got to go, though, with the idea that the life force is always the driving force within the greatest artists, because the life force is, after all, what the greatest art is all about. It's a very, very touching poem. It's not funny, but it's witty and insightful. And here's the poem Poop. He could draw poems from all of his situations, autobiographical or not. Poop. My daughter Blake is in kindergarten. They're teaching her to be a docile citizen and incidentally to read. Concurrently, like many of us, she has become a trifle anal compulsive. Complications ensue. I ask her what she has learned today. She says, I learned the Pledge of Allegiance. How does it go? I ask. It goes, she says, I poop allegiance to the poop of a united poops of Ameripoop. That's good, I say. That's very good. What else? Oh, say, can you poop by the dawn's early poop, what so proudly we pooped. For Christmas, she improvises. Away in a pooper, all covered with poop, the little Lord Poopus lay pooping his poop. She has personalized other traditional favorites as well. Someone, perhaps her grandmother, tried to teach her the Our Father. Her version goes, Our pooper who art in poop land, hallowed be thy poop. Thy pooptum poop, thy poop be pooped on earth as it is in poop land. Surely Hemingway would feel one-upped. Surely the second pooping is at hand. A fortune teller told us Blake would be our greatest sorrow and our greatest joy. Already it is true. Yeah. Anyway, that's the kind of poem that people like to see and read about Jerry's stuff. He is such a funny guy. But this poem, Beer, I think I'll read this and then I'll give it away. Was on the wall of the 49er. They made a big plaque and put, fiberglass, some paper, and it was on the wall. It's called Beer. Beer. It takes a lot to get you there, but it won't kill you either. Kids like it. The foam makes a fine mustache. When they go to sleep, they dream of goofy pink dragons and slippery little smiling fish. To the adolescent, this is the first taste of the earth's bitterness. He has to pretend it gets him high. He's afraid it will give him zits, and maybe it will. He gives it to his girl and thinks it is because of it she gives herself to him. He doesn't like the taste of it and never will. She doesn't have the thirst for it. She's afraid it will give her a gut, and maybe it will. Eventually, she'll be a little insulted when it's offered her, and probably should be. The best of friends are formed over it. It helps men to speak to each other. A difficult thing these days. It lets men sing without embarrassment of old lang syne, and the sheep that went astray somewhere along the line. It goes excellently with pool and pickled eggs, beef jerky and baseball games. Contrary to popular opinion, it is good for the kidneys, affords them exercise. It is also good for the appetites. We all go beyond it. We all come back to it. It is the friend who eases us through our philosophies. It is the friend we talk to about our women. The one who agrees with us that they are not all that important. It restores our courage in the face of cowardly sobrieties. It laughs with us at our most serious poems, weeps at our pratfalls. It remembers us. It takes us back. Finally, this blessed beer, it eases us towards sleep.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's
Thank you, Ray. I appreciate your loving tribute and the camaraderie you and Ron both have with Gerald. And now our next reader and speaker is Bill Mohr. Bill Mohr is a professor in the Department of English at California State University, Long Beach. His most recent collection of poems, The Headwaters of Nirvana, is a bilingual edition published by What Books in LA in 2018. He worked as a publisher of Momentum Press in Los Angeles between 1974 and 1985 and edited 2 major anthologies of Los Angeles poets. Since getting his PhD in 2004, he has been active as a scholar of West Coast poetry. His Holdouts, the Los Angeles Poetry Renaissance, 1948-1992, was published by the University of Iowa Press in 2011. Here's Bill Mohr.
Oh, thank you, Harry, for asking me to be part of this program along with Ron and Ray. I do teach at California State University, Long Beach, and I suppose if I've had enough to drink, which isn't that often, but if I do, I fantasize that I'm actually worthy to be a successor to Jerry, and at that college. But the fact of the matter is, I can't kid myself. Nobody could fill his shoes. This man was and is a legend for a reason, and I remain in awe of his work and his contributions to poetry, which I think I first became aware of back in the early 70s when I was editing a magazine called Baki, and after I left that, I noticed I kept reading it, of course, as the magazine was edited by others, and the work of Gerald Locklin started showing up, and then I remember seeing his work in an anthology called Poets West that came out in 1975 or 76, and not long after that, another anthology came out that really, I think, started the West Coast getting attention in a way that it hadn't gotten it before. A Geography of Poets, edited by Edward Field. And this is an anthology that included Ron Koertge. In fact, Ron's poems come just before Gerald Locklin's. One of my favorite poems of his that's called The Dwarf. And so one of the things that hasn't been talked about too much is the way that Jerry remained an outsider, I think, all through his career. He paid a price for being different, in that he never really made those establishment anthologies the way that poets of far less worth somehow managed to do. But in our area, I mean, he was always appearing in anthologies. As Ron mentioned, the stand-up poetry anthology, and here's another anthology called Grand Passion, the Poets of Los Angeles and Beyond. And I want to read a poem from that that's sort of in line with the domestic poems that have been read so far by Ron and Ray. This one is called The Best Year of Her Life. When my 2-year-old daughter sees someone come through the door whom she loves and hasn't seen for a while and has been anticipating, she literally shrieks with joy. I have to go into the other room so that no one will notice the tears in my eyes. Later, after my daughter has gone to bed, I say to my wife, she will never be this happy again. And my wife gets angry and snaps, don't you dare communicate your negativity to her. And of course, I won't, if I can possibly help it. And of course, I fully expect her to have much joy in her life. And of course, I hope to be able to contribute to that joy. I hope, in other words, that she'll always be happy to see me come through the door. But why kid ourselves? She, like every child, has a life of great suffering ahead of her. And while joy will not go out of her life, she will one of these days cease to actually, literally jump and shriek for joy. So I think that poem's a really good example of how Gerald Locklin brought a sense of humor to a subject that really deserves respect, and that is our ultimately tragic fates. And Jerry's refusal to take off the comic mask. He wore it with aplomb and a deftness that puts other poets to shame. One of the poems I like of his the most, of course, that appeared in a geography of poets, and I'll let you look up this anthology for yourself. It's called Pedagogy, and it's the poem tells the story of Locklin's remembering of a classroom of sixth graders who taunt and torture a nun who has just recently arrived from Belgium and doesn't know the English language too much. The final line of the poem is, remember, Locklin, when you're going forth to teach, you're dealing with the criminal mentality. And as teachers, I guess, we take that with a grain of salt, but there certainly is an element of truth to that. Jerry's had a couple, at least two or three, actually, if you will, selected poems, and this is one of them. It's called Deep Meanings, and selected poems 2008, 2013, and this contains many poems about works of art, and there are two I'd like to read from it, but we'll see if I get to the second one. The first goes like this, though. Jan van de Kapel, or Follower, A View of the River Maas before Rotterdam, 1645. The harbor is calm but clogged with all manner of craft, from many-masted to single, from crowded decks to deserted, from single-oared to synchronized. Not so different from the congestion of the Los Angeles and Long Beach harbors today, the tankers of oil and natural gas, the containerized cargo ship, the holiday cruise liners, the docks with dinosaur cranes, the wharfs and jetties with solitary ethnic anglers. I suppose their highways weren't often much less congested than our freeways either. Ports of call then, ports of call now. We seldom realize how much we are a product of our topographies. Pittsburgh's three rivers, Portland's big one, all the urban lives along the Mississippi, all the deaths south of the Rio Grande. Nice. There's a subtle political overtone to the end of that poem, and I think of that as the way that Jerry would often unexpectedly cast his searchlight into areas that he wasn't associated with. We don't think of Jerry as a political poet, and yet I think the way that he would frame social life made it inevitable that his poems, in fact, can be turned in that direction. I did a book. I'm mainly known as a scholar rather than a poet, and the book that I did that sort of made my name as a scholar, as Harry mentioned, Holdouts, the Los Angeles Poetry Renaissance. And I included a poem by Ron. I have to say, I'm sorry, Ray, that they cut so many pages out of my book that I wasn't able to get your roofing poem, which is a real masterpiece, into this book. But I did get a poem by Ron the Bear Brazil, and then this poem by Gerald Locklin. And so I'd like to read this poem by Gerald Locklin, which is one of my favorites of his. Because I knew I would be walking her through some of the meaner night streets of downtown LA, I reached my glove compartment and slipped a fold-back knife in my pocket. And we did run the gamut of some fairly unsavory concentrations of humanity. But as each potentially tense encounter approached, I patted my pocket and felt a little less naked. Safely back in the car, I extracted the weapon from my pocket and found us both gazing at a B-flat harmonica, accidentally filched years ago from one of Fred Voss's dodecaphonic parties. That too, the sort of improvised mishaps of life, the misidentifications, and the willingness to sort of set yourself up as the clown of your own joke is one of the things that I think makes Jerry's poems so endearing. I was thinking about, before doing this program, that kind of question that Harry asked about Jerry's poetics. And suddenly I realized that a poet who's also known for having been very prolific, right, Frank O'Hara, is really somebody that Jerry should be set alongside of. And it's that East Coast, West Coast tug of war that is responsible, in fact, for, say, O'Hara being better known than Jerry. But O'Hara was famous for this phrase, right, describing his poems, I do this, I do that. Well, I think Jerry's variation on that, if you will, would simply be, along with stand-up poetry, I joke about this, I joke about that. And that really is the pulse behind his poems. The thing that really makes these poems work so well. Perhaps I could stop here, and Harry, you could ask Ron or Ray another question. I have certainly other poems I could read, but I think it'd be nice to have some closing words from Ron and Ray as we move towards the finish of the program. Thank you very much for letting me be on here. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. One thing I've been enjoying about listening to all three of you is the demystification of poetry, and also the relaxation and the camaraderie that you all have, and the accessibility that we find in Gerald's work. And you use the word humor. I think there is humor, Bill, in that poem you read. I love that poem of his. But as it says in there, that joyfulness it certainly exists in there. So, you all knew him, the first two more than Bill. Bill came along a little bit after Ray and Koertge in terms of Locklin, and all three of you have made your mark in poetry and also fiction. And I just love listening to all three of you. I don't really know any more questions. Maybe Ray, you've told some good things. What do you think about Gerald's style, Ray?
Well, it's conversational, and I didn't realize that poetry could be like that before I met him. I mean, he just introduced me to so many things, and then he introduced me to Bukowski, of course, and to Edward Field and Ron's work. And in reading their work, that influenced my work, influenced everybody. I mean, when Jerry was there teaching, just about the whole time, I think from when he came, I guess, there was a kind of group that was his group. He called Long Beach the new Paris. And so there were a lot of poets, Fred Voss among them, who's become pretty well known. And all of us who hung around with Jerry, and I don't think we ever once talked about literature.
Right.
Not once. We just go and have a good time, and then we go home and write our poems, right? But it had, people think that writers sit around talking about literature. I doubt that very much. Not in my experience, Writers just don't talk about literature at all. They want to talk about something else, get their mind off the problem. But Jerry's school, it was like the school of Jerry in Long Beach State, was very, very influenced by that, and all the poetry there at the time. Things have changed since he left, of course, but there's still the memory of Jerry's presence there at Long Beach State. It's still, he was so strong that, it has so much charisma that it's hard to believe that he's dead.
Yeah.
Because he was amazingly charismatic guy.
Yeah.
Amazing. Anyway, that's about all I have to say about that. But
Well, thank you, Ray.
I appreciate it.
The person I went to first to ask about putting this together was Ron. And so I'm thankful to Ron for his recommendations of who to ask. And since he has known him the longest, why don't you, Jennifer, before I ask Ron, you want to, all right, yeah, Ron, could you just take the last maybe 30 seconds and wrap it up for us about what you think is important for all of us to remember Gerald, his poetry?
Yes. It's very personal in the sense of I feel him, I feel his presence. I miss him a lot. I'll write something and I'll take it downstairs and I'll show my wife and I'll say, Jerry would love this poem. And that's a high standard for me, that he would have loved the poem. I remember saying to him once, we're decades ago, I showed him something. I showed him a lot of stuff early on. And I would say, isn't this kind of talky? And he said to me, yeah, Ronnie, but it's smart talk. And I ought to have that on my computer. I should, when things go south for me when I'm working, I should think, a little more smart talk will get you through this. And that's what I learned from Jerry.
Well, it's 2:00 and Jennifer and her Creative Chaos team are the ones that make this happen. So thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, Ray, Ron, and Bill for your smart talk. Here's Jennifer.
Thank you guys so much. I feel I had the opportunity to sit next to Jerry today, and that was really lovely.